If I look at the last year, for example, where I was quite open about my dad passing away, right? And people reaching out to me about that, I think in particular, and especially other founders and people in the entrepreneurship space, because what you don't realize, and a lot of people try to always present this strong front, there's a lot of founders who are going through a lot of shit behind the scenes. And they felt comfortable to reach out to me to talk to me about that because they've seen that I was able with it too. So I think I was quite proud that I could be that vulnerable, but also that people felt comfortable to come to me with that angle because it's that human element, right?
You're listening to Not My First Guess. I'm Hattie Willis, your host, and each episode I talk to an entrepreneur, investor, or startup expert to unpack their hardest moments, biggest wins, and hard-earned advice so we can shortcut our learnings as founders together. Today I'm joined by Amardeep Parmar, co-founder of The Bae HQ, which is their #1 community for British Asian entrepreneurs, curator of the Tedx Chigwell program, and host of the Entrepreneurs Handbook. As if that wasn't enough, having written and edited hundreds of articles around the subject of entrepreneurship, Amar is also an angel investor. Before lockdown, Amar was a technology consultant, having graduated with an economics degree. But when COVID hit, he decided to invest his time into more creative interest and began writing articles online. He became the second fastest growing writer on medium.com, second only to Barack Obama. This paved the way for a new career, whereby he was able to become a full-time creator in 2021. In this episode, we discuss the pressures of being and calling yourself a creator in the entrepreneurial world, the importance of making and putting out content in order to learn, treating people like people, not putting them on pedestals, social intelligence, lessons learned from podcasting, angel investing, and advice for founders raising for the first time, and so much more. Hope you love the episode. We always start with our guests in the same way. I love to know whether people thought they would end up in entrepreneurship or whether it happened by accident. So for you, what was your journey into entrepreneurship and expectation versus reality?
So complete fluke. Didn't expect to be here at all. I think as a kid, you always have these daydreams about like ruling the world and stuff like that, but it's all delusional, right? It's not actually something you think is going to happen. And I think there's always an idea to potentially do something, but I didn't have any ideas. So complete fluke. For me, it started from writing online. So used to be tech consultant, very standard, what so many other people in the city are. And I always had stuff on the side as like my escape away. I was reading a lot at the time. So it's the whole like quarter life crisis. You start reading self-help. We start reading all these other books. And what I found is I wanted to share my own ideas. So I started writing online in January 2020. Didn't think it's going to go anywhere. Just new year, new me. I thought I was going to give up in 2 weeks, right? You kind of expect pretty much all my other New Year's resolutions I give up after 2 weeks. But I had the lucky break of my first article doing very well. And then all of a sudden, oh, people like me. And then the pandemic hit. So I had way more free time than I've had otherwise. So I was able to do them in the evenings. And it just kind of snowballed from there. So another fluke of where, because I was helping out a lot of other people with writing, somebody noticed that, who then was like, oh, why don't you come on board as an editor? And it was for a prose publication. So until that point, I wasn't actually writing about entrepreneurship at all.
Okay.
I got invited onto that, which I didn't really want, but it just was an opportunity. Then me think, oh yeah, sure. I was like, whatever. And off the back of that, then all of a sudden I'm meeting Entrepreneurial time. I'm engaging with different people. I then had something people wanted because I'm an editor and I'm the gatekeeper, right? So now I have all these random entrepreneurs from across the world reaching out to me, who's basically a nobody in this space. And then it had that rapid growth from there. So June 2021, I was able to quit my job and go full time as being a creator. And that was a really scary decision for me because my identity was like good school, good university, get good grades, go to a professional job, work way up the ladder. I never considered myself as doing like a creative kind of work. And then since then, it's just been like a roller coaster as it always is. And I think I knew it was going to be hard, but I think I underestimated a lot of the admin side of things and a lot of the, like everyone glorifies the fun side and I enjoy the fun side, but there's a load of crap that comes with that. And nobody really talks about that crap. And especially in the creative space, I think, where I'm still a creator in some ways, but it's now gone more towards like entrepreneurship and business. And a lot of people just try to glorify it because probably the same thing where a lot of people are basically justifying the decision. They make this big decision in their life. They need to show the world, oh, I did such a good thing. because it's justifying them making that decision because they don't want other people to judge them. And I think that's what makes it really difficult for when people listen to podcasts or when people getting content, because there's that bias there of people wanting to look good. And I don't have that bias.
And it's so interesting because actually when we started pitching to guests for the podcast, we had this line around, we're trying to de-glamorize entrepreneurship. And all of the guests that we pitched to were like, yes, please tell everyone it's way worse than it seems. And I guess now I kind of want to stride the line between it's not all doom and gloom, but absolutely don't get into it and have these expectations, because I then think it just makes you feel really alone if you think everyone else is having a super glamorous time and you're the only one at the end of the day thinking, what am I spending my time and what am I doing? Can I come back to why tech? So you were writing and you said you were consulting in the tech space. Entrepreneur becomes an opportunity to explore, and you said you didn't really want it, but it was an opportunity. So was tech and entrepreneurship interesting to you at that time, or like how did you get into the space in the first place?
So I had an economics background. So at university, I studied economics. I worked at Bank of England for a year. So I always had the general idea of tech and business, but a lot of it was more, I guess, economics focused, so like overall economy. And I used to read the FT every day. But it was funny, by the time it came to me becoming a writer, I kind of abandoned that world in some respect, because I was like, I'm reading this every day, it's interesting, but then it's not really relevant to my life anymore. Let me do fun stuff instead. So I always had that interest, but I never really had the knowledge of the space I'm in now, the proper entrepreneur world of like angel investing and venture capital. I didn't know any of that stuff really was. I knew about business overall, but I didn't have the nitty gritty of the actual tech sector. So for me, it was really interesting to learn about that. And even as a writer or in that editing period, I was getting a lot of information, but it was mainly people glorifying what they're doing and that side of things. I didn't really get the detail. And I think over the last year or so, that's what I've really learned a bit more about the actual, what are term sheets, what are all these actual underlying things. Like I never heard of the word bootstrapped until about 2 years ago. So I came from this space where I had a lot of general economic knowledge, but not really anything about the actual hardcore entrepreneurship space. So it's been really interesting. And I love that space, but it's not something which, since I was a kid, I had a lemonade stand and I used to read about it all the time. I wasn't that kind of a person.
Yeah, same. And I'm always in awe of those who are, but I think it's nice to hear from someone who's also just stumbled into it and gone, oh, I really like what I've stumbled into by mistake. So you leave your job and you're now a creator. Curious, is that a title that you had then? Like, how did that title sit with you? Because I feel like there's a bit of, and maybe I'm projecting, but I think the entrepreneurial world certainly seems to be, and a lot of people have told me it's very different in the US versus in the UK, but there still seems to be a bit of a judgment of entrepreneurs who are creating self-brand, personal promotion. It's something I've definitely like battled with. Does it feel icky, cringe? Should I be doing this? Is it egocentric? So maybe I'm just projecting a ton onto you, terrible interview technique, but would love to hear your experience with making that leap and how it felt being associated with a full-time creator.
So it's interesting because you said about US and UK difference. So until about a year ago, I basically had no UK presence at all. It was all Silicon Valley based, and Silicon Valley in New York. And then what I had there is, so in that medium space, right? So I did well, whatever like that. But the people I was kind of talking to is like the Justin Welshes, the Dickie Bushes, the people who've got like hundreds of thousands on LinkedIn and Twitter. And obviously, from my perspective as an editor, all of these entrepreneurs wanted to talk to me because I had a skill that they didn't have. So I never really felt that judgment side of things. I wasn't really involved in fundraising or anything like that. I was just a creator, right? So if I was in a different circle today, I would see more of that judgment. But the bubble I was in, people who talked to me are the ones who wanted to talk to me. So I didn't really feel that. And I think the personal branding space, and it's an interesting thing now because I've seen different sides of the table as well, is there's a lot of people who are creators. So if you're not watching the video, I'm doing it like the bunny ear kind of things. A lot of people call themselves creators, and it's not really creating. It's not really creative. It's just regurgitation.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of that goes on of using templates or using ChatGPT. It's like, it's not really creative. And in a way, I would have called myself a writer when I quit my job, as opposed to a creator. Because at that point, it was just writing. That was before any of the podcasts. And writer had a bit more of a pseudo authoritative thing.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I'm a writer, not just a creator. A writer sounds professional in some ways. It also sounds starving artisty, but that writer element was like, there's a skill behind it. It's not just I'm
Mm.
going and talking whatever. It's kind of what I do now, to be fair, I just talk. But that idea was there's an underlying skill. And that was a skill that was respected, I guess. In the UK, I think it's different. And one of the challenges I think is that there's a lot of people trying to build personal brands and it doesn't have an end goal of it in some ways. It's a personal brand to stroke the ego or to get whatever. And it's like, oh, look at me. And I think where the bad reputation comes from people in the entrepreneurship world who've also got personal brands, is often they're disconnected. It's like that personal brand isn't actually helping your business. It just seems like it's more for your ego.
Yeah.
And that's a fine line that I think a lot of people are dancing. And a lot of the time you look at it, it's like, if you're always on LinkedIn posting, or if you're always at different events speaking, when do you actually run your business? Or like, when are you actually making money? Or how is your business running? And that's, I think, where some of the judgment comes from.
Yeah, and I was actually speaking to someone the other day who was saying, should I build a personal brand? And he said the exact same thing. But if you're just always posting on LinkedIn, where are you growing your business? And I think, to your point, it depends on the outcomes, because I know lots of people who externally it looks like they're just posting, but actually that's their sales mechanics. They then get a ton of DMs inbound and that works for them. But I think, interestingly, I think that problem with people doing it for ego is actually the answer for people who feel uncomfortable to do it, right? So if you're not building a personal brand because you don't want to come across as stroking your own ego.
It's what I was going to say is like, a perfect podcast guest are the people who don't really want to come on the podcast because they're not coming up. A lot of people who ask to come on, I don't want them because they're coming on for their ego. Whereas often the people who I have to ask to come on, I have to kind of convince a bit, they're not in it for themselves. They're thinking like, oh, how can I help the audience?
Exactly.
And those are the people I want. So it's like I said, it's almost like the reluctant creator are often the best people to follow and learn from.
And I think that's the question to ask if you are a reluctant creator, but you're thinking, maybe should I be doing it? Then what is the impact you want to have? And then that allows you to do it with less. I mean, that's definitely my experience. Like, I was at the beginning of doing the podcast so cringe about telling anyone about it. I didn't want to mention it. I went with a friend to actually Huckletree, where you're now based, and didn't talk about the podcast for an entire evening with a load of investors, people who would have been so good to mention it to. And she came around and she was like, Tati told you. And I was like, no. But actually, for me, it was when I started thinking, well, I'm really proud of the guests and want people to learn from them. Why is that embarrassing to say? You were able to distance it. So for you, you've started building in the US. You said, curious, early lessons. What were some of the biggest takeaways from those guests? You mentioned like massive names. What were some of your lessons that stuck with you over the years from the US days where you were kind of building and writing?
So there's 3 podcasts now, and the first one nobody ever remembers, and I don't really talk about it just because it confuses people. But that's the one where I actually made all the mistakes and the actual learning. And that's one that's really important for people to know about in some ways, because people see what I've done with the Bae HQ. I was like, I didn't just come out of nowhere with that. It's like I'd already done over 100 episodes. So by that time, I'd already made loads of mistakes. I'd learned different things. And even now, I keep changing things with the podcast as I learn more. But some of those early guests were more around the creative space. And then I started Entrepreneurs Handbook. And that's where it's got the like big guns of like Mark Randolph of Netflix, Ev Williams of Twitter. And the biggest lesson, it doesn't matter who it is. They all eat, they all sleep, and they all shit. Like, it doesn't matter if you're a billionaire or whatever like that. They're just humans, right? And some of the biggest guests, and I've also generally realized is the bigger on paper the guest, the more real they are, because they don't need to prove themselves. They've not got the ego. Whereas sometimes people come on and they try really hard to impress me. It's like, I don't care. Like, it's whatever, right? It's like, do that. But what I care about is, are you actually helping the audience? And say Ev Williams says the founder of, so he invented the word blog, created Blogger, then he founded Twitter, then he founded Medium. So in terms of like the internet discourse and like written content online, he's basically the godfather of it all. And his takeaway is like, he was very like melancholy, where he was quite sad about some of the impact he'd had, because he said like, I've created all these systems, but they're now being used in such ways that are causing disruptions to the world and causing all these different problems and misinformation. And it's just interesting because you think, okay, it's worth several billion. How can he have regrets? And it shows you that people who get to the very top, it's not just about the money. And it's a really frustrating piece of advice I think people get, is that the money isn't going to make you happy. But when you're trying to get there, then it's like, oh, that's just patronizing. But it's always that case, like once you've got your bases covered, the difference between you being, say, you've got 1 million versus you've got 100 million, unless you want to buy a yacht, like what difference does it make to your actual lifestyle? And the big lesson from all of that is just, it doesn't matter as much. If you treat people like people, then they are people, right? There's a lot of putting people on a pedestal, and we see it a lot in creators and in terms of different entrepreneurs. They're all human, they're all fallible. And the good ones know that. And they will talk to you in that way. If anybody makes you feel little about yourself or that you're not worthy, then that's on them.
So interesting. Actually, I think that's often something founders feel with investors, that they're made to feel little, less than. What's been your experience with that? And actually, any insight to founders? Maybe it's the same lesson. It might just be the same phrase is still useful, but I think it's something I often hear them say in that context.
I think it's interesting so in terms of like the context as well, I've got a conversation with people that I'm not asking them for anything. So it's a different kind of relationship, right? And what I find is that people should be able to change their communication for situations. And it seems like a really obvious thing to say, but people just don't do it. It's like, you don't, if we're at a pub, right, and we're chatting, and say that investor you went to, right? You're not necessarily pitching people. You can just have a normal chat with people. Whereas some people can't get out of that pitch mode. And like, if somebody's relaxing, they don't really want to be spoken to in that way. And being able to have that social intelligence to talk in the right manner is really important. And I think in terms of that belittling side, is that if somebody's a big shot in the entrepreneurship world, the investor world, but you're meeting them in a non-environment where there's a trade-off, right, where you're not trying to get anything from them, then you should just be able to act normal with them. When it's a formal environment of you're pitching them, it's different a bit, where obviously they do have thousands of decks whatever coming in, and it's trying to understand and not take things personally. But it's also about, you can say to them that, look, we're not interested in your company for whatever reasons, but you don't have to be a dick about it. And obviously I've heard all these stories from people about, oh, you had this person on a podcast, oh, they said this to me. It's like, oh, but because often people will be nice to me because I'm not in that, talking to people in that same way. So it is really interesting, that contextual side of things of, can people be agreeable in different circumstances? Because I guess I'll put this question back to you, switching the podcast so I get people pitching me to come on the podcast, right? And some people meet me in person and basically pitch me on the spot, and I know they're not a good fit. And it's like, how do I reject them without seeming like a massive dick? And how have you found that situation?
Oh, great question. I think oh no, because now people are going to see this and know this is what this is code for. You're really like outing me publicly. I think I try and handle it in a few different ways. One is, I will often say to them, like, let's have another chat. I'm really curious to know what you think, what you'd want to share that founders could learn from. And I'm often very candid about, just to be clear, what we're not is a platform to advertise yourself. We're a way to share really candidly what's going wrong as well as what's going right. So if they're just after this kind of perfect image, I can sometimes put them off that way, to be like, okay, but are you willing to share what you've fucked up on? Because that's actually a really big part of the show. And if they're just trying to do this like kind of social peacocking, then they kind of withdraw a bit quickly. Sometimes which is true, if anyone's listening, we do have a really big backlog of guests. So that's the other thing I do say, is like, we are actually like booking out for months ahead at this point. So, you kind of do the gentle, like, I'll call you, don't call me. But it's really hard, to your point. Like, I do think I ask all of my guests pretty much. And I have a couple of people who ask to be on it, but who I already know. So they're like, actually, would love to come on and talk about this. When can I come on the show? But as you said, it's not transactional. There's a relationship there. I already know the value they'd give. I like them shooting their shot. It doesn't feel super pitchy.
Because I guess that's my easiest comparison with investment as well, right? Because when you're pitching to an investor, it's almost like when people pitch me to come on the podcast. And now, so I do, because I angel invest as well. So the angel investing side is being on that. So anybody listening who's potentially going to pitch me now as well, I write very small checks. It's not very meaningful, but obviously having me on your cap table is potentially useful to some people because they've got their network and other things that come with that and so on. But you'll get people like slide to my LinkedIn DMs being like, hey, blah, 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 blah. We're looking to raise some money. Like, we're looking for a minimum of 50K checks. I'm like, who do you think I am? I'm like casually writing 50K checks. And I always try to like, make that really clear that I don't write these. It's not about my ego, right? It's like I'm trying to help. So everybody I've invested in, I've known pretty well before I've invested in. It's quite intense sometimes how people come at you. And there's somebody who I can't remember what they said, what sometimes people try to use, and I'm guessing they've been encouraged by other people to do it. So these pressure tactics, right? Of like, oh, we're looking to close our round, it's really hot. And like, it's like, that's just a lie, because if it was really hot, you wouldn't be cold outreaching to me. Like, you'd be coming through a warm connection or something like that. And when people do that, they think it's working in their favor, what they're actually doing, and then they'll keep messaging me. So if I don't reply for a day, they'll message again, and then message again the following day. It's like, you're really putting me off now. And it's
Yeah.
also, if you look at the size of my check, I'm not worth this effort from you, most likely. But I see it from their perspective too. If they keep getting told to be persistent,
Yeah.
keep messaging people, don't give up, hustle, hustle, hustle. But for somebody from my perspective, I'm like, well, you're actually just annoying me. And that's not a good way to build a relationship to begin with.
Yeah.
And for example, I host events, right? Easiest way, come to my event. Don't pitch me at the event. Have a good chat with me. I'm like, oh, I like that person. Then if you slide into my DMs a week later, be like, oh, by the way, we're trying to raise it. I'm probably more likely to be receptive. But at the same time, like, scaling that is very difficult for people. So it's a really tough challenge, because it's almost, in order to get the funding, you have to talk to so many different people. But at the same time, if you're talking to people in that manner, you're also going to put them off. So it is a catch-22, which is really tough for founders.
And I think the truth is, this spray and pray, I'm going to reach out to everyone, just doesn't work, because to your point, it's so evident so quickly. You've not qualified me in the right way. I don't write those ticket sizes. Super simple.
Yeah.
But also, you just aren't building a relationship. And I think the other thing people get really wrong when looking for investment is they forget that this is someone you're going to have a relationship with. So
Yeah.
you probably want to actually sense check that you want the relationship as well. Like, maybe they're silent money, but you can make a really easy mistake where you think someone's going to be silent money because that's how you've treated them. And then they come into the business, they have shares, and they're going to be very vocal. And if you're just doing this kind of transactional invest now before you've even got to know them, it's
Yeah.
dangerous.
Yeah, and it's one interesting thing that there are so many events in London, right? And I didn't know about this until I started doing them in the last year or so. There are so many different ways you can meet people who know people who can do the warm introductions. And when I go to these events, is that the trouble is people instantly try and pitch, which then gets me defensive. Because if you just try and chat and like, oh, like, what do you do, and talk about your story and stuff like that, and I don't even know you're necessarily raising, and then like later on in the conversation you tell me that, then you haven't just tried to attack me, basically, right? And what I find with that as well, it's just really interesting to see how people engage in different ways. Because I guess you go to events as well where you've interviewed people, right? So, for example, I'll know some of the people on the panel, or I'll know some of the heavy hitters in the audience because I've interviewed them before. So I'll be chatting to them. And actually, we had a panel recently, right, where I was talking to you, and then somebody just kind of just stood in front of me and started trying to talk to you. It's like, I actually know you from before. We were just like relaxed conversation. But what somebody's done is, by standing in front of me, we now both don't like them, which just hasn't helped your cause, right? And why is this people as well, like social intelligence wise, if we are talking and there's somebody standing here, I will try and move a bit, just to include them in the conversation,
100%.
right? And the people you want to get involved with are the kind of people who do have their social intelligence to include people. But as soon as you cut me up, and then you've cut me up, so talking to you, and then you might mention, oh, by the way, he invests as well. And now they're trying to talk to me. It's like, oh, wait, you've literally just cut me up, and now you're going to try and ask me for money.
100%. And I think it's to your point, it's the basics of being a nice person to be around. And I think it can go wrong with investment, where investors just look for people they like to hang out with. And I think that's a different thing. But your point is very specific, which is actually it really matters how you engage this person. And I think it's the same. You often get people who, I've definitely told this horror story in every coaching workshop I've run, or every pitch coaching workshop I've run, around someone who at last year's Web Summit cornered my co-founder and I. Actually, no, that's not fair. She got introduced to us, but then proceeded to pitch at us for 5 minutes. And to your point, it's like, wait until I ask questions. Let this be a conversation.
Breadcrumb, that's what I say, right? Let me be interested in what you're saying. So for example, if somebody asks me what I do, it's like, oh, I can run a community for entrepreneurs. And they're like, oh, tell me, let them ask more.
100%.
Keep them engaged. It's just basics of storytelling and communication in this kind of engagements. And I have it a lot, like you said, where somebody will talk to me for 5 minutes and it's like, none of that was relevant to me. But because you never stopped to see, I could have taken the conversation in a different direction, which might have helped you.
And you might have been interested in a different angle, but they've not given you a chance to be. It's so funny you say breadcrumb. I literally tell everyone, I'm like, be Hansel and Gretel. That is your job as a founder. Like, lead the investor with you to the little gingerbread house. Okay, I want to go into the angel investing piece a little bit more. You've been an angel investor and a venture scout. apart from be a nice human to interact with, which I think is not to be understated as an important piece of advice, what other advice do you have for founders who are raising for the first time and not really sure how to navigate the landscape? And to your point, also maybe really new to this language. You said you only came across bootstrapping recently. Do you think we have a slight problem in startup land where we talk like everyone should know the language? And it's like, you've just arrived, that's still fine. So what would be your advice to someone new to the space, demystifying any terms as you go?
So I think a huge part is just looking at communities as well. So obviously I'm a bit biased here, but for example, we host events all the time that are free. So you come onto one of our events, you might not understand some of the stuff on the panel, but being in that room, you start to understand a bit more. And what I tell people as well is like, if you don't understand something in one of the podcasts, one of the episodes, send me a message and I start creating content around that. Because even, for example, the word unicorn, right? Because I've been working in this like rough around this area for like 3 years now. To me, it's like, oh, people don't know what unicorn means. You start to make assumptions, and it's always challenging that. So unicorn is $1 billion private company, right? So before it's gone public. And these kind of languages, stuff that people don't necessarily know. And what we found is that people will come to our events and it just gives them an insight. Like it gives them a little bit, right? And you keep coming to events. It's a great way to learn, I think. One of the things I think is a challenge for a lot of people, the way they try to go about it, is they'll try to directly say they DM, a cold DM is like, oh, I'd love to go for a coffee sometime. And that's great. But if there's 100 people who do that every month, it doesn't scale. And that's one of the challenges, is that people are kind of push this idea. It's like, oh, just keep cold DMing. But if you're cold DMing somebody who's got an audience or somebody who's doing different things, it's actually going to be quite hard to get that time with them. Whereas if you can have a really specific question, be like, oh, I'm looking to raise money at the moment. Like, I don't quite understand how this works. Like, can you help me? Or can you direct me somewhere where I can? Because I've tried to read up on this. I couldn't really find anything good, right? If you tell me that you've done a bit of work or tried to research something and you couldn't quite work out, I'm way more likely to, okay, I'll help you, right? Whereas, say, for example, a podcast, so many people message, oh, I want to start a podcast and make it successful. Can we grab a coffee? It's like, I know you're not going to pay me for coaching.
Yeah.
It's like, why am I going to help you be successful? Like, I've got all my other stuff to do, all my other to-do list. Whereas if you say, oh, I've started a podcast, and then you say, like, this is the bit I'm stuck on. Have you got any advice in this specific area?
And I think the other thing you said in there, like, please don't underestimate. Please don't let that question be something Googleable.
Yeah.
I don't want you to ask me something super basic, like, which recording software do you use? I'm like, I can tell you it's very quick, but in the nicest possible way, that's zero value add. It's just not.
So say, for example, for me, on the average day, I reply to over 100 people on WhatsApp. In fact, WhatsApp is people who actually know me. If you're more, I go on LinkedIn, cold emails and stuff like that, it's just physically impossible for me to actually reply to everybody. So what we do as well is I've got a ask me anything thing on Monday mornings. So easiest way to get one-on-one time with me, because that isn't that busy, right? Because a lot of people don't actually use it. Just join that YouTube live, ask me questions, and I'll probably I'll reply to you straight away. And if we're also looking at what other people can do if they're trying to raise for the first time and learn the language, there's great resources. Okay, so one plugging like what we do, right? So the Bae HQ's got it. But you've also got like all of the different places like Antler, like Hatch, Seed Legals. There's so many places that have quite a lot of content out there. And sometimes it is quite difficult to understand. But if you've read these different places and you've read, okay, I'm trying to work out what an angel investment is. If you're looking at angel investment, for example, Andy Im is fantastic at that. I really recommend him. But there are these different places. And the challenge is, if you don't know they exist, how are you supposed to learn? But that's what I really recommend is finding the right sources is quite difficult. But you follow people like me, you follow people like you. We're probably going to post about stuff. You'll probably start liking stuff. That's going to help you get along the right direction.
And to your point, look at who adds value in each other's comments. So Andy Im is a great example. If anyone follows me on LinkedIn, you will find Andy Im very quickly because he's actually our board advisor on If We Raise. We love Andy and everything he does, but he'll be interacting. We help each other. Someone actually recently said, if you want to find angel investors, just look at who comments on Andy's posts.
I saw this. I think you posted that yesterday.
He did. We'll put a link in the comments to all the resources you just mentioned, as well as links to follow. But I think it's such an important point. And I think just starting, like if you follow a couple of people, see who else they mention, see who they reference. And it is kind of not embarrassing to have to Google the words. I still Google startup words. I'll be like, actually, I've been using this word for like 5 years and I don't think I know what it means.
So sometimes it happens on the podcast, right? Someone will say something. It's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But like, I'm keeping nodding because they just assume I know. It's like, nope. But another one is CAC. That a lot of people talk about CAC, right?
Yeah.
It's like, I don't know why everyone's decided that everybody seems to know what CAC is. Like, It's customer acquisition cost. So that's like, how much does it cost you to get a new customer, right? But people just use that term all of the time. And it's like, well, how are people meant to know what that means if nobody ever explains it?
And it's hilarious that you chose that example, which is shorthand sometimes for shit, CAC.
Yeah.
And we do bullshit a lot in the startup land. As you said, like so many of us, and actually Abby talks about this in her episode, call out the acronyms. It's not embarrassing that the smartest people I've ever met, I have watched call out acronyms that the rest of us were nodding along to. No one at the table knew what they were, but they were the only person smart enough and humble enough to say, so what does that mean? There are so many terms that you will just hear everyone talk about like it's normal, and they won't think you're stupid if they ask. And also, if you ask, I bet you half of them, they can't explain what it actually means.
Yeah. It's even now when I was saying what CAC was, like, if I get this wrong, it's so embarrassing.
And well, I mean, like we could go into a longer debate. Like there's a big debate on how you measure customer acquisition cost, what gets included. So not everyone's using it the same way, but we'll save that for another time. Actually, I want to come back to the podcast thing because I obviously get asked it a lot. You obviously get asked it a lot. And I think it is something founders are thinking about, particularly founders who are growing community-led products. Should we have a podcast? So first up, who should have a podcast? Second up, what are your non-Googleable tips around podcasts? Or what's the most valuable lessons you've learned? You said you've done how many? You've done over 200 episodes on podcasts, right?
Yeah, over 200 and something. Yeah, I can't remember anymore.
Yeah.
It's 70 on one, 60 on another. It's like 220-ish, I want to say, yeah.
That's a lot of episodes. So yeah, really keen to hear your biggest takeaways that maybe we'll steer clear of which mic and which camera you use, but the really good stuff.
So I think for most people, they shouldn't start a podcast. And overwhelmingly, people underestimate the amount of effort. And people get excited by the idea of a podcast as opposed to the actual work. So think about, I've spent at least, so about 220 hours of my life talking to people on podcasts, right? Which sounds great, but you've also got getting the studio or getting them booked in. People postpone a lot. So especially for Entrepreneurs Handbook, the amount of times people postpone, and because it's generally American guests, it's me having to make an evening free. They then cancel an hour before because they've got a board meeting. I was like, well, I could have gone out this evening, could have met my mates, but I've kept this time free. So it's all of these different hassle factors involved in a podcast, for one. Most people, again, like they're not very good podcast hosts. And it's a skill that you want to get better at or not. Because if it's not a skill that's relevant for you, then why are you going to spend all your time doing it? And I think what happens to a lot of founders is that it's kind of think about what's the actual going to move the needle, right? And it's also think about like, you're not trying to be the next Stephen Bartlett in most cases, right? So for the Bae HQ, I don't need 1 million downloads for it, right? Because I'm trying to serve a particular community and be the authoritative voice in that area and inspire people. So the idea is that that's an evergreen thing. So now if somebody in 5 years' time who's 16 years old is in school and they're like, oh, I don't know anybody, I want to get into an entrepreneurship, they can now go to our YouTube channel and see, they'll buy them like hundreds and hundreds of examples of people who look like them who are potentially doing what they want to do. So it's that longer term aspect of it. And it all comes down to like, what's the actual point of it? And not enough people ask themselves about that. So what you see a lot of, and it's the classic example of so many people don't get past 10 episodes, right? But how much time did they spend on those first 10 episodes? Because what they'll do is waste loads of time on getting the design together, waste loads of time on what's it going to be called, what's the format, where should we host it, what microphone should I get? And it's all just procrastination at the end of the day, right? And it makes sense for most founders, I'd say, if they're going to do a podcast, is to have it as a limited series. Test it out, okay, 5 episodes. And the biggest advice I always have to, whenever people ask me for advice, I haven't got a podcast, I say, just record it. Stop overthinking it, just record it. Record 5 episodes, do it with people you already know. Another big lesson for people is to stop trying to reach out to people for your first episode, because if I don't know who you are, there is no way I'm going to go on your first episode because there's so many other competing uses of my time. If I've seen you've done a bit of work and you've got a bunch of episodes out, you've seemed to be stable, I'm going to come on. And what I've had in the past recently, somebody asked to come on their podcast, I looked at their page and it's an episode out like one time, then like 5 weeks later and 3 months later. It's like, well, you're not showing consistency. So if I'm going to give my time to this, it doesn't really make sense. If you're going to do it, just start recording, do 5 episodes, do it over Zoom, do it over something you already have, do it with somebody you already know, see if you enjoy it, listen back to it. If you can't handle the cringe of listening back to yourself, don't even think about what you're going to call your podcast, something like that. get over that. If you can't get over that after the first 5 or 10 episodes with people you already know, then why are you doing it? And I think that's a huge part of it is just record, just get going, just start. If you find you're enjoying it and you want to do it more, then think about all the rest of it. So just get that first bit out of the way. And then the other part too is just looking at, it really comes down to keep coming back to that North Star as what is the point? And if you can't answer that, and if a lot of people start a podcast, they then don't really enjoy it. It's always sporadic and but then they're like, oh, I don't want to cancel. It's like, if your 10 listeners aren't going to care if you cancel it generally, right? So it's not that big a deal. Just do it. Like, nobody listens to my first 10 episodes anymore. Nobody remembers them. Like, I can probably name my first 10 episodes. I don't think anybody else in the world could.
Yeah.
And it's just try it out. If it fails, move on. If you try it out, it fails, next year you've got a better idea, you want to go again. But don't make it into such a huge deal about starting it.
100%. This is my third podcast as well, ironically. Like, definitely started. But what I would say is, just adding in, I do think the voice cringe thing is a big thing. And I still hate listening to my voice. But like, you do get over it for me, it was volume. And it was like, to your point, you have to care enough about it to get over that. I personally wouldn't outsource editing of early episodes because you kind of need to improve as a host, and it's really hard to do if you're not listening to yourself. But I do think I wouldn't expect that to go, right? Like, I still hate listening to my own voice.
I've got over it ages ago now.
Really?
Yeah, I think I hear myself speak so much that it just zone out myself.
Maybe in 100 episodes I'll be there.
I think once you edit, one thing you might realize, like, I barely ever and ah anymore. And that's because I edit.
You're right. This trains you. But to your earlier point, also, if you're not trying to gain skill as an interviewer or a public speaker, it's not really that useful. And it is very handy if that's something you want to go down. And your point, like, the content lives on. And if you enjoy it and you love it, you can, I do think you can find down the line, especially if you have other income streams and this is marketing and it's cost effective marketing, you can find ways to get rid of the bits you don't enjoy. I don't edit anymore because I don't enjoy editing, but I love the interviews. For me, it's the hour is a complete joy. The coordination's a bit of a faff, but I'll deal with that for the hour with the guest.
I think it's also the evergreen aspect as well. What a lot of people forget is, like, it doesn't matter how many people listen the first week. But let's say for a lot of my podcasts is that if you Google the guest, we're going to come from the search results. So it's there forever. So if you're, let's get an example. So say, for example, right, you're trying to show thought leadership in a new area. If you can make episodes that show off that particular expertise, think of it less about who listens straight away. Think about when people Google you, can they then find the information that gives you more credibility? And that's actually more valuable in many cases of you're showing yourself as, like, I know what I'm talking about. And it's a way for people also to relate to you. Let's say they're researching you online, they've gone to your website. Oh, I don't know about these people. They've just got whatever on their website. Oh, let me listen to them speak for 5 minutes. Oh, okay, cool. They know what I'm talking about. Another thing that I think a lot of people get wrong too is they always think about podcasts from the angle of having an interview kind of podcast. And I know we both have that. And it makes sense for what we're doing. They make sense for what we're doing. Whereas you can have solo podcasts, and that's where you're showing thought leadership, and then generally make them shorter, more regular. But that can also show a good way to build an audience as well. I'd say often some of the best podcasts are when you have a co-host, which is two people always on the podcast, shooting their shot together. They can really build chemistry together.
Like Rory Stewart, Alistair Campbell. Oh, love.
Yeah. And that kind of angle is, again, if it's always two of you and you work together. So let's say you're a founder and you do it with a co-founder, and every week you two talk about topics related to whatever your company's about, then you can really build an audience on that. And it's also quite reliable because you work together.
True.
You're pretty much, hopefully you'd always more or less be able to figure that out. So it's not just going down your favorite podcast route.
Yeah.
It's thinking about what actually makes sense for your business.
And yes, Amar, I will do a co-host podcast with you. You know, we both need another job to do.
Yeah. I don't have enough like podcasts at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. Neither of us have enough to do. But the other thing I think is sometimes really useful for people is thinking about getting clients on your podcast. So this was something we were sneakily going to do at my old company, but essentially we were doing corporate innovation. And actually there are a number of people who we could bring in who were corporate innovators doing interesting things, who other corporate innovators would want to learn from. But it kind of killed two birds with one stone.
It's also prospects, right?
Yeah.
It's not even they're already your client, but just
Exactly.
prospects. And like, oh, we want to talk about your interest in fintech. And it's like, oh, by the way, we also offer fintech services.
Yeah.
Oh, that's convenient, isn't it? Yeah.
And you've basically got an hour with them to show them that you have some interesting comments. But yeah, so I think to your point again, like what is it for? Fit the format to it. Make sure you actually enjoy it because it's going to take so much time. Make sure it's building skills that are actually relevant and useful to you, and that the content is going to be useful to you when it's evergreen. Such good advice. The other thing I wanted to get from the podcast is more recent. What have been some of the things that have been the best piece of advice you've heard? We talked earlier about the kind of US takeaways, but what about the more recent episodes? What are some of the things that have really stuck with you that guests have shared?
As I've gone through different stages of my own journey, I guess, then different things become more important because they're more relevant for me at that time. So now a lot of the thing for me is just like how busy I am all the time. And it's looking at people who are ahead of me and seeing how do they manage their time? What do they do about that? And I think one of the biggest lessons I've learned recently is just like, sometimes it's about you basically choose when you switch off, when you don't. And some of the people can be majorly successful and they're like, oh no, but I need to do this. I need to do that. It's like, you don't actually need to do this. You could just retire and just go and live on a beach in Hawaii somewhere. But they've got that, they put themselves under this pressure of almost an insecurity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's me working out what's the actual, beyond just the business, what's the actual point of any of this, right? And it's making sure that everything I'm doing, even though I'm driven by a mission and driven by like the impact, and obviously with my dad and everything like that, right? That's a very core drive of my life, but it's not the only thing in my life. And seeing people who've gone different ways and their experiences where maybe I don't agree with all of their life choices, but having those different experiences to draw upon and see like, okay, I like how they've done that. Maybe I should do that too. And I think the boundary setting is, I've seen a lot of people do quite well with that. And it's interesting that it happens for a lot of people once they have kids. So I don't have any kids, but they then really start to, it forces them to choose their priorities. And even me, I took a week off last week. And after that, it's like, okay, what do I want to come back and do? How much of this stuff is like, I actually don't really I'm not really interested. I'm kind of dreading doing. Why am I doing it? And it's interesting to see people further ahead and be like, yeah, why are you doing it? And then I can't answer it. I haven't got a good answer for that. And being called out of my own shit sometimes is really good.
And I do think it's something we talked about earlier before we started recording. When you're a founder and you're so stressed and you're so in it, it feels impossible to take the time to work out what to drop. But it's probably the best way to spend that time. If you're genuinely thinking, everything's going to fall apart without me, I'm the only one holding this together, I'm so exhausted, I can barely breathe, then that actually is counterintuitively the time when you need to stop. And they say, don't they, with, I can't remember which type of nurse, basically the nurses that are most responsive to real emergencies move slower than any other nurse in the hospital, which always surprises me. But it's that point of actually being very deliberate.
I think it's the idea is like, it's better to just, it's instead of trying to become more efficient and more productive, it's drop the things you don't want to do. So you've got more energy for the things you do want to do. And I think before, so much advice out there is about how to become more productive, how to become more efficient. And it's actually like, why don't you just drop things? And then you fill your time with things you want to do. And that's actually probably a best thing, which some people are like, oh, how can I get 1% more efficient? How can I do extra? And they do all these different time management tips. Whereas at the end of the day, it's just cramming more and more into a day, which is making you miserable.
And it's hard, I guess, at different stages of your startup that you are going to have to just do some stuff. But to your point, you should be very clear, I'm doing this for now to get us to this point, and then things will change. And there has to be a change. You can't end up just doing the default things the whole time.
But even with that, it's like sometimes people in startups and founders, they're doing things because they have to do it. It's like, you don't have to do that. Nobody actually cares about that.
Yeah.
And sometimes it needs people to give that blunt feedback about like, is this actually moving the needle, or do you just feel like you need to do it? So for example, a content is a typical one, right? I need to post every day. It's like, do you? Is that actually important to your business, or is it just you feel like you need to do it? And I think that separation, being able to tell, what do you actually need to do and what do you just feel like you need to do? And really questioning yourself on that, because you can get yourself wrapped in this bubble where you just keep pushing yourself on things that just aren't that important.
Which brings me to a slightly different question, slightly different angle. But as an angel investor, do you find yourself giving any like common advice to founders? What are the most common ways that you find yourself supporting them, intervening with them? And I guess that can be at different levels, right? For anyone who doesn't know, and we've tossed around the term a bit, but angel investors are basically people investing their own money. And as the point you made brilliantly earlier, they should, in my opinion, bring more than money. they should bring expertise. So you bring a small ticket, but a ton of network and a lot more than just network. But I think we often get a bit stuck with what could an angel bring. So maybe you can share what you commonly bring and then how you support founders emotionally, practically as well.
I think one of the funniest things about angel investing you mentioned there as well is that it's people reach out to you, it's like, I want your money and also your support. It's like, wait, you're kind of giving in two different fronts. And it's just interesting the way that always works with angel investing is that it's almost like you're advising for free. Well, you're paying to give somebody advice. So it's always been a bit of a head scratch. Like, how does this work? But obviously what happens is as an angel investor, my priorities, my incentives are aligned because if I help the founders and they do well, then that hits my bottom line as well, because then I've obviously got the equity there. And that's the way it works in theory, but sometimes I sit there, it's like, have I been a bit dumb here? I'm paying to give advice, but
We've all been hoodwinked.
yeah. But why I'm doing it in a way as well is so I get that actual experience of the inner workings of a startup, because it's one thing interviewing so many people, but I haven't got any skin in the game there, right? Whereas when I've got skin in the game in these startups where I want them to do well because I've got a financial investment in there, it forces me to think a bit more with stuff on the line. So in terms of where I support, so for me, the obvious one is the network, right? Is I'm always constantly talking to other founders, I'm talking to investors. So I can say, when they're talking about, like, say, yesterday I interviewed a fintech investor. So I can now introduce them to my fintech people and stuff like that. So that always helps out. That's one element of it. And the other element is when people come to me for advice is that I've got this massive data set of what I've heard all these other founders say. And I say, oh, I know somebody who went through that same situation. And even beyond just investment, but introduced to other founders who've been in the same situation can be really helpful too. So a lot of what I'm doing is that more connecting them piece. And part of it too is just being able to give them that outside perspective. Because as we just mentioned about how many people they've become so wrapped up in their own little bubble of their little world, and being able to come from the outside a bit objectively, being like, that's not really that important. Like, you don't need to focus on that so much. Or sometimes what happens too is that people read something online and they, in their heads, that is the way it has to be done. And then I can give that alternative perspective. But it's because from my perspective, what I've got the advantage of is I've got this huge now knowledge base of, I've edited thousands of articles, I've written hundreds of articles, where when people say like, oh, this is why we're doing it because of this, I can give that, actually, there's also this other method. Have you thought about this too? Because that might align. And when it comes to advice to us, one of the things I always tell people is like, never say that you should do something. It's, have you considered this? Or what I try to get people as well is like, oh, Wick, why have you picked that strategy? Like, can you explain like the logic behind that? And then, because you get a lot of unsolicited advice and like, oh, you should do this. But as an investor, you don't know as much as the founders do about the day-to-day of the business. So you should always be trying to get the context from them so you can give the advice that's actually making sense for what their position is. Because you just giving generic advice isn't necessarily helpful because they might have already tried it. For example, with the podcast, right? Somebody messaged me like a couple months ago, came on the episode once, be like, oh, you should do the episodes like Joe Rogan, like 4.5 hours. And it's like, there's so many reasons why that's not a good idea for what I'm doing. But then because you've told me I should do this, I now have to then justify. I was like, why don't you just ask me like why the episode's half an hour long?
Yeah.
And I can tell you, oh, they're this long because of this reasons, right? So that's another big thing I think for founders and some to investors is consider that kind of angle of how they're coming at the conversation. Because if somebody is dictating to you, that's probably not the relationship you want.
100%.
And then in terms of other angels, it's looking at what I see other angels doing quite well is the connection piece is a huge part, but it's also the operational expertise, for example, or if somebody's run a startup before, they can say that. If somebody, for example, is coming to me for content creation advice, I obviously been in that game, so I know more than what they're going to see from guides online. And I think one of the good things that angel investors potentially do as well, they've got a different perspective where they can kind of call out some of the shit advice you're getting, and they've got a bit more authority to do so. Because obviously I know, so from the medium background, a lot of the people I started writing with at that time, they're now massive on LinkedIn or Twitter. I know that their advice doesn't make any sense, but they do it because it makes them money.
Yeah.
So I can legitimately call out these people because if I actually met them, I actually talked to them. I wouldn't do it publicly because it's not what I'm about, right? But if a founder comes to me like, oh, I'm going to follow this advice from this person, like, yeah, they don't actually do that. They're just saying that online. And I can kind of reveal some of the inner workings there a bit more.
Amazing. And I just think it just highlights how much you can get from the right advisor and what it's worth doing that testing of, do you actually enjoy working with each other? Do you want to get their advice? Will you trust, like if Amar says, hey, I'm not sure this is great advice, are they going to trust it from you as well? Okay, we have to do final questions. It's gone. Time has flown. So 2 final questions we always ask all our guests. The first one is, what are you proudest of in your career so far?
I guess it's a typical thing as a founder. It's like I don't think about it enough, probably. But I think the biggest thing, and maybe even if I look at the last year, for example, where I was quite open about my dad passing away, right? And people reaching out to me about that, I think in particular, and especially other founders and people in the entrepreneurship space, because what you don't realize, and a lot of people try to always present this strong front, there's a lot of founders that are going through a lot of shit behind the scenes. And they felt comfortable to reach out to me to talk to me about that because they seen that I was able with it too. So I think I was quite proud that I could be that vulnerable, but also that people felt comfortable to come to me with that angle, because it's that human element, right? None of the achievements that, oh, I've got this many views, I've got that many followers, whatever, right? I've talked to this person, talked to that person. But it's about like, how can I actually make an impact in terms of the way I treat people? And I think if you ask me this in 5 years' time, it should be a completely different answer. Otherwise, then I consider it as I failed, right? Because it should be, I always say, who I am today is like nothing compared to what I'll be in 5 years' time, because who I was 5 years ago is nothing compared to what I am today. So I kind of see it as like my proudest moments are still to come in many ways.
Love that on all fronts. And I think that vulnerability and what that gives other founders, and I really do think this is why we exist, right? Because I believe in, if you can get more people to be vulnerable, less people feel like they're a failure if they go through it. And I think that we could do a whole other podcast on like losing parents and how it impacts everything. But to your point, one of the biggest learnings is like, you let that shape a period, and then you also have to keep going and doing new things, which is hard in its own right. But you couldn't be more right about you've got to be prouder of something else in 5 years. Okay, final question. What is the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
I think it comes back to what I said with the podcast as well. It's like, just do it. There's so much overthinking. And at the end of the day, it's people don't pay as much attention to it as you think they do. And it's a little bit different now where we've got a bit of an audience, things like that. But at the beginning, if you try a podcast and it fails, so what? If you try a side hustle and it fails, so what? Like, I can't remember all of my failures. There's nobody keeping a score. And there's so many things that even with Bae HQ in the last year, there's things I tried to launch. They didn't really work out. I got rid of them. Nobody asked me about them. Nobody's like, oh, you said you're going to do this and you didn't do it. Because it's just the way it is, right? You try things out, they fail, and you go again. And that's the caveat of, when I say just do it, it's like, don't quit your job and like put yourself into financial distress, but just start things in a small way, take as minimal risk as you can, and just get going. Because there's so much you can just overthink, and it's just, life's short. And also life is in many ways, a lot of things you do really aren't that deep. Just try.
Love it. Such a good note to end on. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you for having me. Been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening. Before you go, please do take a minute to follow so you never miss another episode. We have some incredible founders coming up. And I always love to hear what resonates with listeners. So do drop us a direct message on Instagram @NotMyFirstGuest with any moments that meant something to you, ideas for future episodes, or your own entrepreneurial stories you want to share. Until next time, happy startupping. One of the most annoying things that can happen to any of us is getting cold outreach that feels like the company hasn't done any research on you at all. So it's no surprise that investors like outreach from founders that feels like they've actually researched them. That's why I was so excited when the founder of ShipShape.vc, Daniel, reached out to me about sponsoring this episode. ShipShape.vc is a search engine that's free for founders to use to find investors who've been sharing content that shows they're interested in startups like you. I've already been talking about ShipShape.vc on panels I've been on and to founders I coach, because I genuinely think it could be a massive game changer for startups. There's a link in the show notes to learn more if you're interested.